Hello there, I'm Dr. Julia, one of the editors here at edit911.com. This video is part of a series, Editing a Dissertation, How a Professional Editor Finds and Fixes Problems. When I disappear from the screen, I'll be replaced by a PowerPoint presentation on finding and fixing passive voice and the correct use of first person in dissertations and other academic writing. You may seem I've picked two separate topics here. Technically I have, but passive voice and not using first person properly have a lot of overlap, so I can't really do a good job of talking about one without bringing in the other one. So here's our goal for this lesson. We want to find and fix passive voice. And by fix, I mean turn into active voice. So let's start with this really awful sentence. To the beaker were added 3 drops of iodine by the dispenser. Most people reading this are going to be unhappy by this seriously convoluted syntax. However, just making the sentence sound a little better doesn't address the issue of passive voice. 3 drops of iodine were added by the dispenser to the beaker. Sounds better, but we don't achieve active voice until the verb connects to the active participant in the sentence, namely the dispenser. So the dispenser added 3 drops of iodine to the beaker. That's what we want. So, we know this. Active voice is good. It's direct, it's powerful, it's authoritative, it gives credit where credit is due, and it assigns blame. It's nice, it's straightforward, and it's not wordy. Now, passive voice, on the other hand, as we all know, is bad because it is indirect. It's weak and wordy. Really wordy. It seems very humble. It hides credit and it avoids blame. So here we go with the Chicago Manual of Style, the sort of Bible of publishing in America and several other countries, that tells us that passive voice is typically, though not always, inferior to active voice. There are some times when you need to use passive voice, and we'll talk about that. You might just want to change up your sentence structure or whatever, but passive voice is very much the exception. For the rule, you want to use active voice. Good old APA, the American Psychological Association, which always seems to address things with a bit more specificity than Chicago, although it does talk about less than Chicago does, points out that you should use the active rather than the passive voice. The passive voice is acceptable in expository writing when you want to focus on the object or recipient of the action rather than the actor. So, for example, a parking space could not be found for the president of the company. The passive voice there lets us structure the sentence to stress the contrast between a small thing and an important person. For the most part, we want that active voice. So, that brings us to a question. If active voice is so much better than passive, why are so many papers stuffed with passive voice? What is the appeal? Well, we can answer that question if we look at the qualities of active and passive voice this time from a student's possible perspective. Namely, active voice is intimidating. All those things that we like, it's direct, it's powerful, it's authoritative, these are not the ways many grad students, and that's what we're talking about here, grad students writing their big dissertation, they're not made to feel direct, powerful, and authoritative. And there's that one right there, assigns blame. Now, meanwhile, passive voice is safe. It's indirect, so it's easier to back away from statements. It's wordy, and you might say, oh, well, that's bad. But many students, unfortunately, see wordiness as a plus. Dissertations are supposed to be long, right? Now, humility is a lesson a lot of grad students, frankly, learn a little too well, and that doesn't serve them well when they get into the job market, as I'll talk about in a second. Now, it hides credit. Students still think in terms of citations and references, but credit should just be a part of the discussion. So-and-so did this and so-and-so did that. And here's the big one. It avoids blame. That's why politicians like it. You can state actions as though they just happened. The solution was shaken until the sealed beaker exploded. Yeah, and who kept shaking that beaker? Well, it doesn't tell you. Now, before we get to the next slide, I want to deal with the fact that some of you may be thinking that students should be humble and non-authoritarian. And it may well have been your own experience that that sort of writing was encouraged, but the attitude toward PhD students has recently changed quite a bit, because they're not seen as crossing the threshold into a community of academia, but more that they're getting ready to go get a job. We have a very job-oriented culture. So attitudes regarding grad students have changed. PhDs are expected to jump into a highly competitive job market and right into the job. Now, one of these places that you can really see this is how very strongly CVs and resumes stress experience and publishing. People seem to want you to have experience even if you don't have experience. And that means that dissertations and pretty much all postdoctoral writing should aim to be direct and powerful, well, not arrogant, but definitely authoritative. And you really only get that with the active voice. So now that we're on the same page about why we want to seek out and destroy passive voice, let's talk about the signals that can alert us that passive voice is taking place. Right off, I'm going to explain why I've brought in first person and third person into this. I also want to get into the fact that using to be is a sort of sign, but it's not proof. We'll discuss, and oh my goodness, being wordy. These are all big signs that passive voice is taking place. So generally, we know papers should be written in the third person. Students in the humanities particularly know all about this. When you're comparing great authors' use of profanity in the 19th century to how they write today, you're probably not going to bring in personal experience. However, a major red flag for passive voice, as well as a major cause, is when the sentence avoids first person even when the author is the actor. The author is oftentimes the researcher or the subject or the observer, and when they're trying to write the paper as though they don't actually exist, you get some horrible sentences. APA says it best. Inappropriately or illogically attributing action in an effort to be objective can be misleading. Examples of undesirable attribution include the use of the third person and anthropomorphism. In other words, a paper is not a person. Papers don't feel, studies don't theorize, and experiments don't hope. So here we go with some examples of anthropomorphism and passive voice. Iodine was added to the solution in the hope that it would detect any starch. So evidently iodine is hoping here. Taken together, these results can be used to persuade the worst skeptic. Used by whom? Exercises in this research study were built to evaluate social skills. Well, exercises can't evaluate anything. In each of these cases, there's a person who is sort of present but not really. And so these attributes that should be given to the author are being spread around. The iodine isn't worried about what it's doing. In each instance, the researcher author is doing action. When you write about something you did and remove yourself from the prose, you end up assigning your emotions and goals to things that do not actually feel or care. Now, the APA comes in again and tells us that we should use a personal pronoun rather than the third person, for example, when describing steps taken in your experiment. So this is a specific time when you, the author, have done something and you need to talk about it, and trying to dodge around the use of first person is just going to make your prose look awful. When we're dealing with third person self-reference, or what some guidebooks call self-conscious talking, you're going to slip into this really poor passive voice. When the t-test was applied by the researcher, the means were determined to be significantly different. The implications will be shown to be impactful by the author's conclusion. And by the way, these are all sentences that I have, don't tell anybody, lifted from papers that I have edited. So don't be thinking I'm making up things here. So talk about convoluted syntax. And yes, if you read a lot of prose like this, you get used to it, but that's not a good thing. I think about, again, how the author is hiding in that safe zone under the rock, protected from attack, instead of just saying what's what. Now, a second red flag here is the use of to be, is, was, had done, and the rest, especially when paired with another verb. Now, this is not an absolute, but it's very frequent. Jane is not being fooled by the villain. The hypothesis has been proven. The climate is being affected by pollution. These are the sort of sentences I imagine most people think of when talking about passive voice. But there's a lot of passive voice out there that doesn't use the to be plus a verb. So while the use of is being done to is passive, you can't just go by that alone. The much more definitive issue for these kinds of sentences isn't the verb, but the actor of the verb, who is missing or misplaced. The fort got attacked. That's nice. By whom? The tree was destroyed. By what? The study was completed with the help of Lexis Nexis. Well, that's nice. But who actually did the study? In my links to further study at the end of this lesson, there's a technique suggested in the article, a scary easy way to help you find passive voice, which is to see if you can add by zombies to the sentence. I kind of like this. If you can add that, by zombies, then the sentence is probably passive. So the fort got attacked by zombies, and the tree was destroyed by zombies, and the study was completed with the help of LexisNexis by zombies. And remember, after you add by zombies, the voice is still passive. The actor isn't missing, and this is what I was talking about before, so much as misplaced. And we need to make it clear that the simple presence of to be doesn't automatically mean the voice is passive, although it is a huge hint. Sometimes to be is active. For example, when the actor is actually present, such as with a basic adjective. Kayla was happy, Sean is not attractive, the subject is complicated. These are not passive sentences. This is not passive voice. It's kind of boring, but it's not passive. We often use the word to be when we are asking questions. Was the agent reactive? Is all hope lost for Santiago? And I could come up with a whole bunch of sort of outlying examples of this, but when the actor is present and in its place and connects the verb properly, then it's active. So even though when you see was and it was happening and so on, and you say, oh, well, that's passive, not always. Now here's another really big red flag, and that is being wordy. Not all wordy prose uses passive voice, but almost all passive voice is wordy. And think about it. When you're trying not to have an authoritative voice, when you're burying your own role, when you're not giving credit, and when you are, big one, hiding blame, this all takes up a lot more words than just saying who did what. In fact, one of the more painful aspects you might recall of grading undergraduate papers is that showing them that replacing passive voice with active will make about half of their paper disappear. I'd like to think we've all outgrown that by the time we're writing dissertations, but old habits die hard. So here we go. We have some passive and active sentences. The climate is being affected by pollution. Pollution affects the climate. The study was completed with the help of LexisNexis. We used LexisNexis to complete the study. So let's start putting some of this into actual practice. I want you to, please, find the passive verbs. Participants were given a set of 9 archetype cards and were instructed to select the 2 they perceived best represented their personality. Good communication was necessary for participation. The exercise was a success. So I want you to see if you can really hone in. There's some active voice and there's passive voice here. Pause the video if you like, because in the next slide I'm going to show the answer. I've put those passive verbs in red. Participants, blah, 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 were given, were instructed, and was necessary. You may question my call that was necessary as passive, but I'll be explaining that soon. I'm trying to show how sometimes you really have to get in there and not just pick really obvious examples. Now there's active, the exercise was a success, and the two they perceived best represented. We've got some active and we've got some passive, because there's almost always a blend, and so you have to sort of root it out. Now, we have a big issue here. This was all about finding and fixing. So we found the passive voice, hooray for us. Now we need to fix it. We need to make the passive voice active. So it's a pretty simple process. We find the verb, which we've already done. Then we find the actor. And remember, the presence and placement of the actor are what truly make the voice passive. And then make sure the verb applies to the actor, now that we found that actor, not the acted upon. So let's practice what I like to call syntax alchemy. We're going to take the actors, we're going to find them, and we're going to put them in brown. And we've already got this idea. We're going to take the verbs that we see are passive and we're going to put them in red. So it was stated that their employment would not be affected by participation. Now notice the first actor is missing, and the second actor, participation, is misplaced. It's being treated by the syntax as though it were an object instead of the subject for affected. So stick in that missing actor and put the second actor in the subject's place, and you get, we stated that participation would not affect their employment. I should note here, I've done it a couple of times, that the first person can be plural if the author is part of a team. And in fact, there are some science journals that want you to use we, whether or not the author acts alone. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot again with this passage. Remember this one? Now I want you to find the actors. And I'm not reading all that again. Pause the video if you like. Next slide is going to show the answer. So again, the first actor is missing and another is misplaced. Now I'm going to explain my thinking about good communication was necessary for participants. You can argue that was necessary is a verb and an adjective, but the sentence in context isn't being used that way. At this particular point in time, those participants had the necessity of receiving good communication to do their task correctly. Being necessary goes to the participants and their needs, not to the quality of good communication, as would be the case with, say, good communication is necessary for a well-lived life. So you can see that active voice isn't just about being more direct, it's about being more accurate. Passive voice obfuscates. Active voice pushes the author to call the shots correctly. Okay, so now that you've ID'd the actors and the verbs, how would you put the sentences so that the actors and their verbs go together, rather than having verbs going to what is being acted upon? Pause the video again if you'd like, because the next slide shows my answer. Okay, so we want something like this. We gave participants a set of 9 archetype cards and instructed them to select the two they perceived best represented their personality. Participants needed good communication, and so on. So there you have it. Use these red flags to find passive voice, match up the actors and the verbs to change the passive to active. So that was, if you recall, dodging around that first person, using forms of to be and then another verb, and then you're reading and you just realize how wordy everything looks. These are all little flags saying, look, I think you got some passive voice going on. Now there are a couple of tips before I want to end up here. First person, of course, should be edited out when the author actor is unnecessary, as in I think, as for me, in my opinion, and all those other things. People teaching MLA are well aware of this when you're dealing with undergraduates. Like, everything is what you think. Stop saying I think. And then another thing to recognize, even when you're dealing with somebody at the dissertation level, I don't know, maybe even especially then, Students will resist wanting to use that active voice. They're comfortable. They're in their zone. They're using passive. They don't mention themselves. They feel good. Well, they look bad. So encourage them as needed. I have a couple of places to look for further study. As always, edit911.com/blog. In particular, 2 articles, 4 principles of good academic writing, and the narrator, the #1 most important fact of fiction. And here's that article I mentioned about a scary, easy way to help you find passive voice. Lesson over. Thank you for watching, and please enjoy our other videos on editing a dissertation from edit911.com.